25 soldiers dead in a single ambush, and the Mexican government is calling it a security incident. Let's be real about what that means, because Washington doesn't want you connecting these dots. What just happened in Mexico isn't a crime story, it's a war story. Cartels didn't just kill 25 National Guard troops, they defeated a military unit in open combat. That's not gang violence, that's an insurgency. And when an armed non-state actor can systematically overpower a nation's uniformed forces on their own soil, we have to ask the question that every major network is deliberately avoiding: who is actually governing Mexico right now? Because here's what the economic data, the political science, and the boots on the ground reality are all telling us simultaneously: the Mexican state does not have a monopoly on force anymore. And in political theory, when a government loses that monopoly, it has already begun to collapse. Now, why does that matter to you sitting here in the United States? Because Mexico isn't a foreign policy problem. Mexico is a domestic reality. 2,000 miles of shared border, a $1 trillion trade relationship under USMCA, millions of families, businesses, and supply chains woven together so tightly that the instability on that side of the Rio Grande lands directly in your economy, your communities, and your tax dollars, whether your politicians admit it or not. So let's slow down and actually think through what we're witnessing, because the speed at which this story is being buried under celebrity gossip and political theater in this country is itself a story worth telling. 25 National Guard soldiers were ambushed and killed in Mexico, not by a foreign army, not by a terrorist organization headquartered in some distant cave in the Middle East, but by a cartel operating 45 minutes from the United States border. And the American mainstream media gave it roughly the same coverage they'd give a mid-level local election in Nebraska. That silence is not accidental. That silence is a choice. And every time powerful institutions make that kind of choice, we have to ask ourselves, who benefits from you not knowing this? Let's begin with the basics, because context is everything when we're talking about Mexico. Mexico is not a poor, weak, insignificant nation that we can afford to dismiss as a third world problem unrelated to American prosperity. Mexico is the United States' largest trading partner as of 2023, surpassing even China. We are talking about over $800 billion in goods and services crossing that border every single year. The automobile industry, the agricultural supply chain, the electronics sector, all of it is deeply, structurally, and perhaps irreversibly entangled with Mexico's stability. So when you hear about 25 soldiers dying in an ambush, what you should actually be hearing is a signal, a very loud, very serious signal, that the foundation underneath one of America's most critical economic relationships is cracking. Now, here's where I want you to really pay attention, because this is the part that requires us to think like political economists rather than cable news consumers. The cartels operating in Mexico today are not the cartels of the 1980s and 1990s. They are not simply drug trafficking organizations focused on moving cocaine and heroin across a border. What has emerged in Mexico over the last 2 decades is something far more sophisticated, far more dangerous, and far more structurally embedded in the fabric of Mexican society. These organizations, and we're talking primarily about the Sinaloa Cartel and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, though there are dozens of factions operating in different regions. These organizations have evolved into what political scientists call parallel states. They control territory, they collect taxes, they provide security, employment, even social services in regions where the Mexican government has failed to show up for generations. That is not criminal enterprise anymore. That is governance, informal, brutal, and unaccountable governance, but governance nonetheless. And this matters enormously for understanding what happened when those 25 soldiers were killed, because that ambush wasn't just an act of violence. It was a statement. It was a cartel saying, in the most direct language power understands, we are not afraid of your military, we are not intimidated by your uniforms, and we are not retreating. That is an organization that has calculated, correctly or incorrectly, that it has enough power to directly confront the armed forces of a nation state and survive the consequences. Think about that for a moment. Think about the level of resources, intelligence, firepower, and institutional protection that kind of confidence requires. Because cartels in Mexico are not operating in a vacuum. They have relationships, corrupted, coerced, or financially incentivized relationships with elements of local government, state police, federal agencies, and in some documented cases, the military itself. The ambush of 25 soldiers isn't just a tragedy, it's a window into an ecosystem of institutional rot that has been decades in the making. Now, I want to talk about the United States' role in all of this because we cannot have this conversation honestly without turning the mirror on ourselves. The United States is the largest consumer of illegal drugs in the world. Full stop. No other nation comes close. The demand that sustains these cartels, the billions of dollars in cash that flow southward every year to fund their weapons, their soldiers, their corruption networks, that demand originates here in American suburbs, in American cities, in American homes, across every income bracket, every racial category, every political affiliation. The cartel economy is, in a very real sense, an American economic phenomenon that we have outsourced the violence of to the Mexican people. And then we have the audacity to talk about Mexico's instability as if it's a Mexican failure, as if it has nothing to do with the fact that we have never, not once in our history as a nation, seriously addressed the demand side of this equation. And then there are the guns, because if the drugs flow south to north, the guns flow north to south. Roughly 70% of the weapons seized from cartels in Mexico are traced back to the United States. Legal gun stores in Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California, straw purchases, gun shows, private sales that bypass background checks. The United States is the primary weapons supplier for the organizations that just killed 25 Mexican soldiers. We are not observers of this crisis. We are participants in it, active, structural, and largely unacknowledged participants in it. But here's where it gets even more complicated because American complicity doesn't end with drugs and guns. It extends into the financial architecture that makes all of this possible. Cartel money gets laundered through American banks, American real estate markets, American shell companies. The financial system of the United States, the most sophisticated financial system in human history, is being used to clean the blood money generated by the murder of Mexican soldiers, the displacement of Mexican communities, and the destruction of Mexican democratic institutions. And our regulatory response to this has been, to put it charitably, inadequate. To put it accurately, it has been a deliberate choice to prioritize the smooth functioning of financial markets over the human cost of that money's origin. Now, let's talk about what the Mexican government is actually dealing with, because I don't want to reduce this to simple American culpability without acknowledging the genuine complexity of Mexico's internal political situation. President Claudia Sheinbaum, who took office in late 2024, inherited an extraordinarily difficult situation from her predecessor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. AMLO, as he was known, pursued what he called a hugs not bullets strategy toward the cartels, an approach that prioritized negotiation and social investment over military confrontation. And while the philosophy behind that approach had genuine merit, you cannot shoot your way out of a structural poverty crisis that generates infinite cartel recruits. The practical execution was often characterized by a kind of studied avoidance that allowed cartel territorial control to expand dramatically during his 6-year term. Sheinbaum is now facing the consequences of that expansion, and she's facing them with a security apparatus that is deeply fundamentally compromised. The Mexican National Guard, which was created specifically to be a cleaner, less corrupted alternative to the federal police, has itself been infiltrated in various regions. When 25 of your soldiers can be ambushed and killed, that requires intelligence, intelligence about troop movements, patrol schedules, communication systems. Someone with access to that information fed it to the cartel. That is not speculation. That is the only logical explanation for the tactical precision of that ambush. And it means that the rot goes deep. It means that Scheinbaum is not simply fighting an external enemy. She is fighting an enemy that has cells inside her own security forces. This is what political scientists call a captured state scenario, and it is one of the most difficult governance challenges that exists in modern political economy, because you cannot reform institutions that are actively working against the reform. Every intelligence operation gets leaked. Every anti-cartel initiative gets undermined from within. Every honest official who tries to do their job gets targeted for corruption or assassination. Human Rights Watch and other international organizations have documented hundreds of cases of Mexican officials, journalists, and activists being killed for exactly this reason. Mexico is now consistently ranked as one of the most dangerous countries in the world for journalists, not because of some abstract cultural problem, but because the cartels have understood that controlling information is as important as controlling territory, and they have acted on that understanding with lethal efficiency. And while all of this is happening, let's zoom out and look at the geopolitical picture, because Mexico's crisis does not exist in isolation. It exists within a broader restructuring of global power that is changing the rules of everything. China has been systematically expanding its economic and political presence in Latin America for the last 2 decades. China is now the largest trading partner of Brazil, Chile, Peru, and several other Latin American nations. Chinese investment in infrastructure, ports, telecommunications, and energy is reshaping the economic geography of an entire hemisphere. And Mexico, sitting right on the border of the United States, is not immune to this dynamic. The fentanyl crisis, which has killed over 100,000 Americans per year in recent years, runs directly through Mexican cartel distribution networks, but its chemical precursors originate almost entirely in China. That is not an accident. That is a supply chain, and supply chains have architects. Now, I'm not suggesting a simplistic conspiracy theory here. I'm suggesting something more structurally significant, that the interests of geopolitical competitors sometimes align with outcomes that weaken their rivals, and that when those alignments exist, the incentives to disrupt them are limited. China is not going to voluntarily shut down the precursor chemical supply that fuels fentanyl production, because that supply is generating enormous cash flows, destabilizing American communities, and straining the US-Mexico relationship simultaneously. From a pure realpolitik standpoint, that's an extraordinary return on a relatively modest investment. And the United States has struggled to develop an effective policy response, because doing so would require acknowledging the full complexity of the problem, including the domestic demand side, in a political environment that rewards simple narratives and punishes nuance. Let's also talk about what this means for American immigration policy, because the connection between cartel violence and northward migration is direct, documented, and almost entirely absent from our mainstream political debate. When cartels expand their territorial control in Mexican states like Guerrero, Michoacan, Tamaulipas, and Zacatecas, they displace hundreds of thousands of civilians. People who have lived in those communities for generations are given a choice: work for us, pay tribute to us, or leave. Entire towns are emptied. Agricultural communities that have farmed the same land for centuries are abandoned overnight. And those displaced people, with nowhere to go within Mexico because cartel territory is patchwork across the entire country, make the decision to head north. The migration that American politicians have spent years debating as a border security problem is, at its root, a cartel governance problem. You cannot solve it with a wall. You cannot solve it with deportations. You cannot solve it with asylum restrictions, because the people coming north are not coming because they prefer America. They are coming because staying home has become incompatible with survival. And here's the economic dimension of this that nobody in Washington wants to talk about honestly. The remittances that Mexican migrants, documented and undocumented, send back to Mexico from the United States total approximately $63 billion per year as of recent data. That number has surpassed Mexico's oil revenue. It is now the single largest source of foreign income for the Mexican economy, which means that the Mexican economy, at the level of millions of individual households, is structurally dependent on the migration of its citizens to the United States. The same migration that American politicians campaign against is the financial lifeline that prevents Mexico's social fabric from completely disintegrating. Remove those remittances and you don't get a more stable Mexico. You get a more desperate Mexico. You get a Mexico where cartel recruitment becomes even easier because the alternative, formal employment, community stability, a future, has been further eroded. This is the kind of systemic analysis that gets deliberately excluded from American political discourse because it makes simple solutions impossible and requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about the interdependence of our economies, our societies, and our failures. It's much easier to talk about building a wall than to grapple with the fact that our drug demand, our gun exports, our financial system, and our labor market are all deeply implicated in the conditions that produce cartel violence, Mexican instability, and northward migration simultaneously. Now, let's talk about what a realistic path forward actually looks like, because I'm not interested in simply cataloging problems without engaging seriously with solutions. And I want to be honest with you about how difficult this is, because anyone who tells you there's an easy answer is either lying to you or hasn't thought seriously about the problem. The structural roots of Mexican cartel power are deep, multi-generational, and connected to failures of economic development, institutional governance, and international drug policy that span decades. There is no surgical strike, no military operation, no diplomatic agreement that resolves this in a news cycle or an election cycle. What would actually begin to move the needle is a comprehensive rethinking of drug policy in the United States that takes demand reduction seriously as a public health priority rather than a law enforcement problem. The evidence on this is overwhelming. Countries that have moved toward decriminalization and harm reduction, like Portugal, have seen dramatic reductions in drug-related deaths, HIV transmission, and the social costs of addiction without the explosion of drug use that prohibitionists predicted. Reducing American drug demand doesn't eliminate cartels overnight, but it begins to starve their revenue model in a way that nothing else can, because you cannot arrest or bomb your way out of a market that generates tens of billions of dollars annually. Serious gun regulation, particularly targeting the straw purchase pipeline and the gun show loophole, would begin to reduce the flow of American weapons into cartel arsenals. This is not a radical position. It is a position supported by the evidence of where cartel weapons come from. When 70% of seized cartel weapons are traced to American sources, the American regulatory environment is part of the cartel's military supply chain. Changing that requires political will that has been successfully blocked by well-funded lobbying interests. But calling it what it is, American complicity in the armament of organizations that kill soldiers and displace civilians, is at least a starting point for honest conversation. Financial regulation that actually targets cartel money laundering through the American banking system would begin to attack the economic infrastructure of these organizations in ways that military operations cannot. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network and other regulatory bodies have the tools to do this work more aggressively. What they lack is consistent political priority and the resources to implement it at scale, because the same financial institutions that process cartel money also process legal money, generate tax revenue, and employ lobbyists who have relationships with the same legislators who would need to fund more aggressive enforcement. That's not a conspiracy. That's just how institutional interests operate in a capitalist democracy. And finally, a serious bilateral economic development agenda, real investment in the regions of Mexico where cartel recruitment is most intensive, designed in partnership with Mexican civil society rather than imposed from Washington, could begin to address the structural poverty and institutional failure that makes cartel participation an economically rational choice for millions of young Mexicans who have no other viable path to income and security. The Marshall Plan, whatever its political motivations, worked as an economic intervention because it addressed root causes of instability rather than symptoms. An equivalent commitment to Mexican development, properly structured and genuinely bilateral, would generate returns in stability, reduced migration pressure, and reduced drug supply that would far exceed its costs. But it requires a political imagination that currently seems beyond the capacity of Washington to muster. Here's what I want to leave you with, because I think the most important thing I can offer you is not a policy prescription, but a framework for understanding what you're watching. What happened in Mexico when those 25 soldiers were killed is not an isolated incident. It is a data point in a much larger pattern, a pattern of state capacity declining in the face of non-state actors who have accumulated enough economic power to challenge formal authority directly. We are watching this pattern not just in Mexico, but in multiple places around the world simultaneously. The monopoly on violence that defines the modern nation state, the foundational premise of Westphalian international order, is being contested in ways that have no clear historical precedent in the modern era. And the United States, for all its military and economic power, is deeply implicated in the conditions that are producing this contestation. The question that history is going to ask about this moment is not whether the cartels are bad. Of course they are. The question is whether the institutions of democratic governance in Mexico, in the United States, and in the international system as a whole are capable of responding to this challenge with the intelligence, the honesty, and the structural seriousness that it actually requires, or whether we are going to continue managing the symptoms, performing the theater of border security and military deployments and diplomatic statements, while the underlying conditions that produce cartel power continue to compound. 25 soldiers died in that ambush. Their names deserve to be known. Their deaths deserve to be understood in full, not as a crime story, not as a border security talking point, but as evidence of a systemic failure that runs through the economic and political choices of two nations simultaneously. If we can look at what happened clearly enough to see our own role in it, honestly, without the defensive nationalism that makes real analysis impossible, then maybe, just maybe, we can begin to make choices that are actually equal to the scale of the problem we're facing, because the alternative is to keep doing what we've been doing, and the bodies keep piling up, and the cartels keep governing, and the soldiers keep dying, and we keep watching, and nothing changes. That's the choice in front of us. And it starts with understanding exactly what we're looking at.